Welcome to For Your Info.
En inglés.
You got it. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another exciting edition of FYI. Welcome back. I hope you guys had a wonderful summer. I got some R&R. R&R is what we call rest and relaxation. Yeah, it's also rock and roll, and I had a little bit of that too. But it's great to be back, and we're going to kick off this September with a very, very special guest, someone who I've wanted to have on the show for a really long time because I think, A, she's a wonderful person, and B, I think she's got a lot of interesting advice to offer to all of you guys. So guys, please welcome Tannia Suarez. I'm going to pronounce it a la española. Hello, Tannia. Welcome.
So great to be here. I'm so excited to talk about pronunciation and language and all of the goodies.
Great. Well, first, let's get started. I'm sure some of my listeners may know who you are, but if they don't, tell us who you are professionally and where we can find you on the internet.
Absolutely. So I'm a communication coach, and I specifically work with professionals who are non-native speakers. So we do a lot of corporate communication, leadership, and career growth. On social media, you can find me at Ask Tannia. And there I do a lot of advanced and technical pronunciation practice for American accent.
Great. So you work with all kinds of businesses. You work with people who are looking for work, people who already have jobs and need to improve their communication skills, correct?
So mostly in finance and tech. So it's a lot of really in-depth job interview, training, and also being able to grow in corporate leadership. So having the confidence to give presentations and have small talk that enables really good networking.
Sure. And that's a key word you just said there. The better you communicate, the more you can network. And we all know the importance of networking. In Spain, they do it naturally, networking. Obviously, they're naturally good at chatting. And as you said, small talk. Let's start with that idea of small talk, because a lot of times I focus on small talk with the students because they say, well, we're talking about the weather, or we're talking about sports or current events. But then I tell them, they're saying, we don't see why that's important. And then I always tell them, I say, well, you don't start off a business negotiation saying, sign here. You start finding some common ground. So tell us a little bit about the importance of small talk in business and in communication in general.
Small talk is everything. And I'll be honest, I think it gets a bad rap. And so yeah. I think that people hate it or people feel it's really awkward. And this is also native speakers. A lot of native speakers feel small talk is very contrived or fake. But I like to think of it as an opportunity where the expectation is set. So everybody knows, like, what do you do? How's the weather? Where are you from? So when you're confident asking and answering that type of question, you don't have to think about how to initiate. It's already like the social expectation is there. So you can get really comfortable with that. And then you practice how to change the subject, how to go deeper, how to get to topics that are more interesting. But I like to think of it as, here's your formula, initiate those connections. And that way there's less pressure and you can focus on breathing and being more relaxed and being yourself.
Sure. And in the end, it's things that we all have in common. I mean, who doesn't say, oh, what a hot day it was today? Or what? I mean, these are things that everybody can share in, and it's not controversial. It's an easy way to strike up a conversation, even in a bar. Let's, taking away the business thing. When I was single, I never walked up to a girl and said, let's talk about the intricacies of life. She would definitely turn me down, but it would start with something in common, a common ground, like, oh man, this bar is packed or something like that. And then instantly we were able to connect, and it might be a very trivial or simple thing, but that's what connects us at first. And then, as you said, we can go deeper. So yeah, I always say that to my students, the importance of knowing not just how to talk business or business English, but also knowing how to, talk about all these little things that we have in common. So great. Very interesting what you do. She's at Ask Tannia with 2 N's, guys. You can find her on Instagram. Are you on Twitter? Are you on other platforms as well, Tannia?
Absolutely. So Instagram, TikTok, I have a podcast, the Business English Podcast, which is Spotify, Apple, wherever you listen, and also a YouTube channel.
All right. Well, I'm going to put links to all of this stuff in the show notes. So to make it really easy for you guys, you can click on those links and make sure you follow Tannia. You won't regret it. You'll learn tons of amazing pronunciation tricks and so much more. As we'll look at, you do much more than just pronunciation on your channels, but you're teaching people how to communicate clearly, or my favorite phrasal verb that I use with my students, to get their point across.
Yes.
Right. That's our point in life, right?
Absolutely. But the thing that I find, or the reason I focus so much on pronunciation, is because I find that a lot of learners are so worried about pronunciation that they allow themselves to communicate and connect because they're so focused on the accent. So for me, if you can just let yourself feel a little more comfortable with maybe tiny mispronunciations or just figuring out the words that make you insecure, your shoulders can relax and you can really have those conversations. So you can make, new friendships or new connections, which that is why English, I think, is so beautiful.
Yeah, sure. One of the greatest things about myself, being bilingual, because a lot of people say, okay, it opens up a lot of doors. But I said, also, do you know how many friends I've made when I've traveled? Because I was able to speak Spanish, or even in Miami, I remember going to the door at a club and I spoke to the guy in Spanish. He goes, oh, you can come in this side door. And I'm like, oh, okay. So we don't have to wait online. Oh, great.
VIP.
But it's because now you're in the club. As my daughter and I say, we're in the English club.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, you get to make friends on a global level.
Sure. And English and Spanish. I mean, okay, Chinese, there are more Chinese speakers in the world, but English and Spanish speakers are more spread out throughout the world. So I always say, if you speak English and Spanish, the Americas are yours, from Tierra de Fuego in Argentina to Canada, to up to Alaska. So really, it opens a lot of doors, not only on that continent, but also in Europe and many other places where English or Spanish is a major language. So we found out about you professionally, but now I'd like to find out a bit about you as a person, and what are your interests? What makes you tick? Also, how did you get into teaching? Once you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your heritage, because your last name is Hispanic as well.
Indeed. So actually, I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana. However, I grew up in a bilingual household because my family is from Mexico. So our rule at home was, which actually technically Spanish first language. And so I didn't actually learn English until I went to preschool and just picked it up at school. Wow. Yeah. So and then my mom is a Spanish teacher. So growing up, we would go to preschool or like regular school, and then we would come home and my mom would have escuelita. So she would buy textbooks from Mexico and teach us like Spanish grammar and literature and all of that.
That's great. So your parents really made an effort to make you bilingual. It wasn't just, you woke up one morning and said, hey, I'm bilingual. There was actually an effort behind it.
Yes. And then being the US and being first generation, I think it's really easy to slip into Spanglish because there's so many people who, when you're speaking with other Hispanics, that can slip into some English words and it's fine. And so, but since my family lives in Mexico, my mom wanted to make sure that we could do that full switch. And so if we needed to, we went to visit family. So for her, it was very, very strict rule of knowing English at home to help us distinguish, which was really interesting. I think of course, as a child, you don't appreciate the gold that is. And now as an adult, I'm like, oh, so lucky that I didn't have to learn it from scratch. But it also gives me a sense of empathy for being in a multicultural upbringing.
Sure. And you weren't only exposed to 2 different languages. As myself, you were exposed to 2 different cultures, 2 different foods, 2 different types of music,
Actually, in New Orleans, so this was before Katrina, the storm, New Orleans has the largest, I think, Honduran population. So there really weren't that many Mexicans when we were there. So even though my identity in terms of family was Mexican, I grew up with a lot of Central Americans and Cubans. So it was this wide range of different flavors, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so having that exposure and then being in the South, so having that specific kind of American exposure, it's always made me really fascinated about cultures and even I mean, I've always been a nerd. So definitely the linguistic differences and nuances has always been something I appreciate.
Sure. Is that how you got into teaching? Seeing your mom teach you and being a language nerd, as you said, as I'm a self-proclaimed language nerd too.
Yeah.
I was always noticing, oh, that's an interesting sound, or why do they say that like that? Did you eventually say, I want to do this. I want to teach people how to communicate. I want to work in languages.
Interestingly, no. So I
Oh.
think seeing my mom be a Spanish teacher, I never considered teaching. So for me, I always thought business was going to be my track. And then my background is actually in communications. So I actually started my career off working in public relations. So it's still in the communication sphere. And I'm still an interest in linguistics, and that's my background, but not language teaching specifically. It wasn't until I just fell into it because I was going to go back to college to go get my MBA. And I thought, okay, I need to pay for the MBA. As you know, it's so expensive in the US. So I thought I need to get some jobs to help me pay for it. And I thought maybe I can do substitute teaching because my mom had said like that's a nice way to make money. And so I went in to ask some questions, and it just so happened that they were really desperate for a bilingual educator for one of their schools. And they literally were like, "Can you start tomorrow?" I had never thought about it. And I thought, okay, well, you know what? I can do night classes for my MBA, and then I can do this to help supplement the income. So started the next day. It is one of the hardest things I've ever done, but it ended up being really fulfilling. And so I ended up switching. Instead of an MBA, I got a master's of arts, or an MAT in teaching English.
Okay, interesting. I mean,
And so I did that for 5 years.
That's what you call really falling into something. You start tomorrow.
Yeah, I was so nervous because it was teenagers at that time. And I'm like, oh my God, what do I do with these kids? I don't know what I'm doing, but it was trial by fire. And it was one of the hardest, most fulfilling experiences of my life. So that's where I fell into teaching. But then this was before even video calls were popular, were a thing. I remember we ended up moving to Las Vegas for an opportunity for my wife. And that's when online learning was really kind of growing. And I thought, okay, that could be something I can try. And that's how I fell into, again, teaching English online. That's when we started. And that worked out perfectly.
That's incredible because, something told me you had a calling, like, you're such a great teacher that like you woke up and said, I've got to teach. This is my thing. But now that you tell me this, that you kind of followed kind of your intuition, it was a situation where it offered you the flexibility, the hours you needed. And then you said, wait a second, this is something I really enjoy doing. And you could see yourself doing. And then as you said, when things got digitized, when we left the analog world a little bit behind, you said, well, wait, this is going to be a need here online through video classes, through social media platforms, and you parlayed it into that. When was that about? When did you start with the online teaching? When did you make that switch?
Let me see. Online teaching, it was probably 10 years ago, maybe 10, 12 years ago. So around that time frame. And because of that, and so it was different because when I was teaching in a school setting, I was working with teenagers and it was ESL. So it was very close to my heart in terms of also kids who were bilingual and bicultural. So then this changed because it was adults. So teaching English online to adults was a whole different world. And that's where I started just getting more and more adults who needed English for work. And that's where I felt like, oh, the stars are aligning. I was like, I can do like my passion, which is business and communication, but do it for an audience that I'm so in love with. I love being able to help people find their voice and their confidence.
Sure.
And so to me, that's when I realized like, oh, this is it.
Everything
and
kind
that
of
also
clicked.
gave me yes, it clicked. And I was just like, oh, okay, I need to figure out how to make this really help me thrive. And it gave us the flexibility because we both worked online. We became digital nomads.
Great.
Before COVID, we spent maybe like 7 or 8 years living in about 14 different countries.
That's when I met you, more or less, because you're like, I'm living here, but I'm going there next month. I'm like, wait, I can't keep track.
Yeah, that was a fun time.
So this job has not only helped you has helped you help people. I don't mean to be redundant there, but it's also helped you see the world, travel, and given you a certain flexibility that maybe you wouldn't have sitting in a corporate job, sitting in what you initially were going for, business, where, okay, now we see a lot more flexibility with working from home and digital nomads. But back then, there were few and far between. Let's say you didn't see too many digital nomads, and now it's many people are looking in that if you have something to offer and you don't want to fall into the, the rat race, so to speak, in the corporate world, you can create your own platform and of course still do exactly what you were doing, but on your terms. And that's empowering. That's a great feeling.
Absolutely. And to be able to work with people, I like to keep track of the countries that I work with. I mean, I've been blessed to meet clients from over 30 countries.
Oh, wow.
And to have that kind of access to different cultures and all sitting in my room and staring at a screen, but to make connections with people who are living so far away from me it's just a very cool time to have this kind of business and to have this kind of training, and for other people to have access to teachers online from different countries. I think it's really exciting.
Sure. And even from a student standpoint, a lot of my students, one of the things they love is that we can have class on a Saturday morning. They can be in their pajamas and having a cup of coffee. They don't have to get dressed, go sit in a classroom, get in their car. So it's almost empowering, and it almost makes it easier. I look at it like the gym theory. If your gym is 20 minutes from your house, if it's right downstairs, makes things a lot easier. So if your English class is a click away, it's going to be, that part of, oh no, I got to get over there. You eliminate that part. And it's literally, instead of taking an hour in class, spending an hour and a half to get there and back, it makes everything a lot easier for the teacher and for the student. And they can learn from anybody around the world, which is fascinating as well. Tell us a little bit about some of your hobbies, some of your interests. Obviously, traveling, getting to know new cultures is one of them.
The two things I love the most is food and architecture.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
So I love being a foodie and trying like different flavors and just going to different, whether it's a food truck or an amazing restaurant. Like I like trying from everywhere, and also just walking around different cities and soaking up the architecture.
Wow.
It is just I just think that's something so soothing.
You're going to love Madrid and Barcelona when you come by Spain. Definitely.
Yeah, actually, Barcelona was my first city.
Oh, yeah. Barcelona, Gaudí. I mean, Anton Gaudí, the famous architect. I mean, it looks like you're in a Dr. Seuss novel.
Yes, that's the perfect description.
It's like, what is this place? Like, or a Tim Burton movie, one of those kind of like where nothing is really what it looks like.
It's like Dr. Seuss hung out with Tim Burton and they had a lot of wine.
Yeah.
And it's a Gaudi building.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let's get into some pronunciation. What are some of the differences that you've known? Because obviously many students are like, should I speak British English? Should I speak American English? What's the difference? Is there a big difference in both senses? Obviously in speaking and in using it. Are you going to get more jobs if you speak American English? What are your thoughts on the differences between the two big ones, I should say?
In the industries that I work with, which are mostly like tech and finance, I would say American English is most beneficial due to the globalization of those industries.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're choosing, you really want to go with what is important with your industry and for your needs. So if you're learning English for fun and you happen to live near England and that's where you're going to interact more, then British English would be, I think, a great option. For work purposes, I do tend, and of course I'm biased, but even looking at the industry trends, I would say American English is probably the better option. That being said, in terms of pronunciation, I think the R's and the T's are easier in British English. And they're a little trickier in American English, but it's worth it with practice.
Sure. And we're going to look at some of that in the bonus episode. We're going to look at some of the, I always tell people, you want to hear the difference between British English and American English. You just have to speak about your family. My mother,
oh.
my father, my sister. So you have to growl a little bit in America. My students say, you sound like a dog. I'm like, well, that's how it sounds. So yeah,
It is.
their
It's
R's are
very marked.
breathy, right? They're very, sister, sister, mother. But it's true. I tell my students, obviously, American English has a larger scope. I mean, we put out more not just the business, but most series that come out, most movies are American English. So even Dutch
Mhm.
people and Mexicans who are watching movies and series are hearing American English. So it's by far spoken or listened to by more people around the world. All right. Well, interesting stuff. We're going to look at more examples of the British and American stuff in a little bit. But here's a question for you. And then we got to wrap up the first part, but we're going to get into the second part. Is listening as important as everybody says? Because a lot of people say that in order to speak English really well, you have to listen a lot. You've got to immerse yourself in it. Is this an overstatement, or do you think listening is an important skill as well?
I love this question because I think it's something that is so essential, but it's about how you do it. So, to answer your question, yes, listening is super important, but in particular, active listening.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I stress that is because, as you said, and you said it perfectly, where most people will listen and repeat. But that's what learning the language. And I think when you take it out of learning English for learning English and instead learn English to communicate and to connect, that's when you have to listen differently. And so something that I notice when you're active listening, and this is really difficult at first, but I promise, like for those of you listening, with practice, it gets easier. What you're probably doing, or people usually do when they're in conversation, is they're planning in their head what they want to say next.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not really listening. So what happens is you think that planning in your head is going to help you speak more confidently. But what actually happens is that you're not listening. And when you don't listen, your body language changes. You look disinterested. You're not picking up on the words that they're using, which you can incorporate into your answer, which makes it easier English wise, but also helps you make that connection deeper because they feel like you're listening to what they're saying. And the other weird thing that happens is when you're not active listening, when you're just listening and planning, you stop breathing. And this is something that everybody does. You hold your breath because you think that helps you listen better. But what happens is your anxiety increases. From a cognitive perspective, the lack of oxygen doesn't allow you to access the creativity or the language that you need.
Wow.
So it's about listening while breathing.
There's like a physiological change in your
Yes.
body. Wow. Fascinating.
I spend half of my time when I'm first training this, just telling people, relax your shoulders and breathe.
Sure.
And you'd be surprised how much the tension builds in the shoulders. You're holding your breath and it impacts your confidence and it impacts your English and your word selection in a way that until you get out of doing it and you realize like, oh, this is so much better.
Sure. And in real life, if we translated this into real life, it's be in the moment, be present, like really be listening, absorbing what you're hearing. Like my daughter listens attentively, even when I don't want her to. I'm like, you just heard that? Oh, oops. But she doesn't know grammar. Obviously, she's going to be 4 years old, but she repeats everything to a T perfectly. And why? Because she's really listening. She's listening not just what I'm saying, but how I put it together. She's like I'm realizing from my daughter how I speak English. I don't say look at, I say look at. Because she goes, look at it. And I'm like, that's me, because she only heard me. So it's even a mirror of myself. And it's fascinating. It's true, because I say the same thing with grammar. I tell my students, it's good to know the grammar because, in your mind, you can say, okay, I get it. This is countable. This is uncountable, whatever. But if you're thinking about grammar when you're in the middle of a conversation, I can guarantee you're not in that conversation. You're not present. And it's going to affect your breathing, your anxiety, your nerves, right? Everything.
And you're not going to feel like yourself.
Right.
So that's a really big barrier I find when people get shy or they feel like they don't feel comfortable speaking English. I'm like, that's because you're not you. You're a robotic version of yourself. And that's not fun. Yeah. So speaking to the point about American versus British, to plug the American English, one of the benefits of American English is conversationally, especially, we're very casual in terms of structure and interaction. So a lot of times I tell people that non-native speakers are actually better at English because they are so much more focused on structure, and they'll use constructions that sound so fancy or formal. Right. I'm like, your English is better than a native speaker. Like, just trust it.
Yeah, it's true.
We have to actually, take it down a level.
Right. Yeah. Because we don't want to. I always tell my students, I go, we take our grammar books and we threw them out the window in second grade. Like, we learned the grammar and then we're just saying, okay, we got it now. We don't need the books. We don't need the theory. We know it. And I guess that's hard. It takes time. It takes being exposed to the language, which is why I always tell my students, listen, immerse yourself in English. And it's never been easier. You can live in Spain, get your news, your Netflix, and everything in English. And you can social media, everything, podcasts. I mean, now English is everywhere, or any language, and it's at your fingertips. Whereas our parents, if they wanted to be immersed in another language, they would have to travel to that country, live there for 6 months, do an Erasmus program or something to that effect. So, and now it's never been easier. But also, students, that means you have no excuses.
Something that is really important with all of this access to information, I do think it increases the likelihood of passive learning, because you're ingesting, you're taking in the podcast and the episodes. So a way to make sure that you activate your English when you're watching a Netflix episode, for example, there's always that 2-sentence description of the episode. Read that out loud.
Oh, good.
I recommend read it out loud before, and then after the exposure of listening, read it out loud after. When you're about to listen to a podcast episode, same thing, read the description. So you're activating your mouth and the speaking in a way that's low pressure because you're reading it, but you're connecting what you're listening to and what you're learning to actually communicating it.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's that final step. Okay, listening is good, absorbing, but then it's got to come out your mouth at some point.
Yes. 100%.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right. Well, these are indispensable tips, guys, that we're learning here from Tannia. We're going to take a quick break right now, and then we're going to come back with our bonus episode, which is exclusively for patrons. So if you guys want to join us, you can go over to patreon.com/Alberto Alonso, and you can check it out. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the toughest sounds for Spanish speakers. We're also going to talk about some of the biggest pitfalls, some of the biggest mistakes that we've come across throughout the years as well. And I want to take this moment just to urge you guys again to follow Tannia, follow her on social media, her YouTube page, all of that stuff. And I'll put the links in the show notes. Tannia, thank you so much for joining us here in the first part. And I hope you guys will join us in the bonus part as well.
Also, I'd like to take a moment to send a shout out to all my patrons, especially my super duper students, Javier, Paco, Roberto, Jose Maria, Mila, and Alex. And don't forget about my interstellar students, Carmen, Lina, Isa, Paco, David, and Edgar. I sure hope you'll join us in the bonus episode of today's FYI.